Number 10. 3 fights and a funeral. This first point is still up for debate, as many historians are still trying to confirm how this whole gladiator thing started, but one possible launching point for these bloody Olympics was a blood rite at funerals. They served as a kind of violent eulogy, so instead of standing up in front of the mourning families and reading, I don't know, like a haiku or a poem, they fought out their feelings. Healthy. When esteemed aristocrats died, families would hold bouts between slaves beside the grave, like right there. Front row seat for the corpse. This was to demonstrate the virtues that were demonstrated by the dead in life. This presentation of blood in battle also could have stood in for human sacrifice. As you can guess, the tradition would gather quite the crowd and eventually evolved into the epic gladiator battles we know today. Julius Caesar, for instance, organized a massive gladiator fight between hundreds of warriors to honor the death of his father. By the end of the 1st century BC, the gladiator games were state-funded and much, much larger.
Number 9. No heckling. When the Colosseum was built in 80 AD, about 50 to 80,000 fans of Roman combat, they would pour in. The energy was high. This was their only source of entertainment, really. They weren't watching The Witcher Season 2 back then, so you know, they had to do this. So some fans would get so into the action that they of course would heckle. Well, just like a comedy show, they too can hear you heckle. You're throwing off their entire performance, and that's a no-go. Today, a 21-year-old usher will politely ask you to keep it down, but in Roman Colosseum days, you don't get a warning. One of Rome's more violent emperors, Domitian, was pretty die-hard when it came to the Colosseum and the games. So much so that one day, a guy in the crowd heckled a gladiator, probably talked smack about his oiled up abs, or you know, smile, that's always a fun one, we hear that a lot. So Domitian had him pulled from the audience to the center of the arena where a group of aggressive dogs finished him off. How terrifying is that? No heckling, ever, even now, stop.
Hey Taylor!
Yeah?
Stop! Number 8. Vegetarians. So believe it or not, the diet of a gladiator was largely vegetarian, though it wasn't really like they had any choice. It was expensive to keep these fearsome warriors, and meat wasn't always easy to come by, so they had to fill in the gap with other sources. Based on the excavation of 22 gladiators, their bones revealed that their typical food was wheat, barley, and beans. How they could tell this from their bones, no idea. Science, man. There was little sign of any meat or even dairy as well. However, they did drink another kind of mysterious substance. This study was carried out by the Medical University of Vienna in Austria and the University of Bern in Switzerland. And not only did it reveal the aforementioned vegetarian diets, it also showed evidence that they consumed a health-boosting tonic made out of plant ashes. It can be compared to the way we consume magnesium tablets or vitamin C. It was believed that it helped restore gladiators after a battle. Now obviously 22 is a pretty small sample size, but hey, that's still at least that percentage, so.
Number 7. Death before combat. With most of these Roman gladiators, they are trained, they understand a specific style of combat, and they're paired off with an opponent that's somewhat equal. But not all of these gladiators are UFC fighters. Not all of them are Russell Crowe, okay? A great amount of gladiators were criminals who were forced to fight each other in the name of entertainment. These prisoners of war were not really on board with fighting a lion with a dagger. They understood that this was probably a one-way trip, so many of them took their own lives before the combat even began. This one story is haunting, but it makes total sense. 29 prisoners were all set to fight these crazy animal battles in front of thousands, but they all ended up strangling each other. They took each other's lives because that was easier to them than walking into this nightmare. That's horrible. The reason this was an easier choice to make was because saying no would lead to an even more painful and still public execution.
Number 6. Afrodesiac. The fanaticism around gladiator warriors was like the fanfare around the Beatles, the Stones, and Justin Bieber, like all around, all combined. You might even argue that they were some of the very first celebrities, and that was mostly due to their sex appeal. They were sex bombs. Ooh, beefy men. Yeah. Roman women believed that even their sweat was an aphrodisiac, like Old Spice deodorant. The gladiators won massive fame and even had their own action figures, as children would make their clay dolls emanating their favorites. Their image would be placed on walls in public spaces and even endorsed products. Women wore hair jewelry dipped in gladiator blood or mixed their sweat into hair cream or cosmetics. To have a dream about one was said to foretell a fortunate marriage. There was even graffiti in Pompeii that depicted one fighter who would catch women in his nets at night, like a sexy boogeyman. Ooh.
Number 5, collars. Collars were made for animals, dogs, cattle. No one likes wearing them. Well, maybe except a certain anthropomorphic community, that is. You know what I'm talking about. Sadly though, Roman slaves did wear collars, similar to dog tags in the military. It's a form of identification, and you know that said person is a slave, which in case you didn't know was super uncool. Anyone who says otherwise is just off, or if I had to take a guess, they're the same people who would choose to side with Caesar's Legion in Fallout New Vegas. You know gosh darn well that the NCR is the right choice, and or also leading the Las Vegas Strip by yourself. I mean, come on, who doesn't want to be the CEO of 3 luxurious casinos in the Mojave Wasteland? But I digress. The collars are naughty. They're bad. Don't do that. Especially the explosive ones. I don't like it. Number 4, currency. There's something that just tickles my fancy when thinking about Roman gold coins. Maybe it's my inner historian, or maybe it's because my persona is Wario. Wario likes gold. Can't blame me. However, the Roman denarius is not what we're talking about right now. I'm talking about the ancients' other favorite currency, flesh and bone. Unfortunately for the slaves of Rome, they were traded, bought, and sold like an item, or used as a currency. When you build a whole society around such a horrible thing, this just kind of makes sense. It adds up. To make bad things even worse, sometimes when Rome was expanding or the Gauls got a little too close to Rome and some borders were being exchanged, it often meant that some slaves would change hands too. And by that, I mean they were taken and put to work for another boss that was probably less nice to them since they didn't come from the same area. Boy, history sure is mean sometimes. I tell you, that history, oh boy. Number 3, the bathhouse. I didn't think this was going to be a secret to anyone, but the slaves weren't just working in the fields or putting up some arches that last longer than most marriages. No, some poor folks had the duty of polishing pearls, smoking the salami, waxing the carrot, and finger fishing for clams. I think you get my point. Yes, the oldest profession in the world. However, it wasn't exactly a profession in this case, more like it had to be done or there would be consequences. Eugh. For me, brothels might sound great on paper, but when you're laying down in the doctor's office and he's trying to scrape barnacles off your piece of deal, well, I can't say I didn't warn you. Number 2, gladiators. Guys, I actually learned something today. I know, right? Imagine little old me learning something. Gladiators, you know them, you love them. The movie is okay in my opinion. The warriors who duked it out in the Roman Colosseum weren't always brought in chains. Some were volunteers actually. Honestly, as I was writing this, I thought to myself, well, gosh darn it there, feller. If that don't sound like that's the Hunger Games. That's right, being dragged away from your family and forced to fight in blood sport. All you're missing is Donald Sutherland's buttery smooth voice. I also can't help myself in mentioning this, but probably the first battle royale ever too. So maybe it's just a part of us. Something about the last man standing that we love so much, and why I want to spend all my savings on Fortnite skins. Number 1, thumbs up, very nice. Listen, we've all seen the movie. Joaquin Phoenix is standing there looking all Roman-like and looking into the heart of Russell Crowe, knowing damn well this will probably be his last blockbuster. That's just how it goes. There, in suspense, the audience waits to see what his thumbs do to decide his fate. Well, this is true of the Roman slaves in the Colosseum, however, there's a couple things that differ from the movie. 1, being not all who went into battle perished, and 2, the thumbs down might be what you want, actually, not the thumbs up. Meaning that the thumbs up meant yes, go ahead and finish the plebeian. A thumbs down, a fist, or even waving a cloth might have meant no, spare the poor soul, have mercy. All I know is that I do not volunteer as tribute. Sorry, Prim.
At number 10, population. It's pretty messed up just how many slaves there were in ancient Rome. In their society, wealthy people owned dozens, if not hundreds of slaves to do their menial work. In ancient Rome, anyone could be sold into slavery. No matter your race or background, if you could work, you could be bought and sold. Historians believe that about 90% of the free people in Italy by the 1st century BCE had ancestors who were slaves. At one point, the Roman Senate debated having slaves wear uniforms to be able to distinguish them from the rest of society, but they ultimately decided against it when they realized just how many slaves there were. One ancient Roman politician once said, quote, "It was once proposed in the Senate that slaves should be distinguished from free people by their dress, but then it was realized how great a danger this would be if our slaves began to count us." End quote. They literally couldn't afford to let the slaves know how many other slaves there were, because if they would have known they outnumbered the other members of society, this could have led to a revolt. I mean, there were slave revolts regardless, but we will get to that later. At number 9, lifestyle. Ancient Roman slaves experienced different lifestyles and living conditions based on a number of factors, often linked to their occupations. Slaves who didn't have a specific skill or trade were often used in mines and agriculture, and those were the harshest conditions that they could have been subjected to. Oftentimes, they were literally worked to death, and since they didn't have any human rights in the eyes of the Romans, they were often overlooked and simply replaced. On the other hand, household slaves received more humane treatment. They were treated better by their masters, and sometimes they were able to get some money in order to buy their freedom. If they were able to buy their freedom, the slaves would become freedmen, which was a social class between slaves and free people. Before we continue discussing the hard lives of slaves in ancient Rome, make sure you guys smash that thumbs up button if you're thoroughly entertained so far, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, Spartacus. At one point, a group of Roman slaves revolted, and though they eventually lost their battle, they survived a pretty long time thanks to one famous slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave who escaped a gladiatorial training camp and recruited thousands of other slaves to fight for their freedom alongside him. For the slaves, Spartacus was their symbol of hope and their leader. This slave army was able to defy Roman authorities for 2 years with freedom in their sights, but unfortunately those dreams were crushed when Roman general Crassus crushed Spartacus and his army. After Spartacus was killed, the authorities came for the rest of the slaves in the army, and they were severely punished. 6,000 slaves who took part in the revolt were crucified, and this was almost a warning to the other slaves against trying to revolt again. Spartacus became a legend, but it wasn't enough to free the Roman slaves. At number 7, ownership. In ancient Rome, slavery and slave ownership was such a common practice that pretty much everyone owned slaves, regardless of social status. Even some of the poorest Roman citizens would own 1 or 2 slaves. Obviously, the more money you had back then, the more slaves you could afford. In Roman Egypt, the average artisan owned about 2 or 3 slaves each. Emperor Nero was known to have owned over 400 slaves who lived and worked in his home in the city, but his numbers are eclipsed by a wealthy Roman named Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, who according to historical records owned 4,166 slaves at the time of his death. That just gives you an idea of just how many people were sold into slavery in the first place. At number 6, freedom. Earlier I mentioned that Roman slaves had the chance to buy their freedom. It was a lengthy process, but this gave a lot of slaves hope for a better life. Things weren't always better after buying their freedom though, and many of them sold themselves back into slavery because things were tough. The process of buying your freedom as a slave was called manumission. This could be achieved in a number of ways. Slave master could grant their slave freedom as a reward for their service and loyalty. The slave could pay their master a sum of money to be freed, or sometimes a slave master could just find it convenient to let their slave go. Most slave masters who chose that last option to free their slave for their own benefit were merchants who needed someone to be able to sign contracts on their behalf, and since slaves weren't allowed to represent their masters from a legal standpoint, they would be freed, but would still work for their master. You also had to be over the age of 30 to buy your freedom, so if you were lucky to live that long, then there was hope of being freed, but with the average life expectancy in ancient Rome being about 28 years or so, and with the living conditions of many slaves, they would be lucky to get that opportunity.
Number 5, bathroom hangouts. Bathroom lighting is key when you go out. Those 1 a.m. selfies never looked or felt so good. Ancient Roman times, hanging out in the bathroom with your friends was quite common, but they didn't have any neon lights or quotes and selfies. It was just a lot of bricks. Oh, and also, it smelled really bad. They didn't have the Charmin Ultra less is more lifestyle. They had to use sticks with sponges to wipe. And yeah, of course, they also had to share. Socializing in these ancient toilets was like socializing at a Starbucks. It was normal. You would spend hours here and you got done, literally. Groups of Romans would discuss business, politics, military strategies, all the while a dude's in the corner just like going to the bathroom. Romans believed the goddess Cloacina was the guardian of the toilet drain system. Cloaca Maxima translates to big drain. I guess when you invent the flushing toilet, you can call them whatever you want. Just don't call any meetings there, perhaps. Might be a good start. Number 4, no soap. Sometimes you're in a rush, it happens. You don't have time to shower, so you do the classic spray yourself with cologne and then hope that you fool the world. It's a smart move, but the ancient Romans were way ahead of you. While they didn't clean their clothes with laundry detergent, it's not shocking to hear that they also didn't use soap to wash their bodies. Instead, they rubbed perfume oil all over themselves to get rid of sweat and all that jazz, but later on, once that oil had dried up, it was then removed with a wooden wedge or a spatula-like tool called a strigil. The world's most painful loofah, sign me up. During dirt and sweat would get stuck to this oil and then subsequently just peeled off. So it did work, but it took a little more time than our usual showers nowadays, our 5-minute rushes before work. For Romans who were well off, this was a whole event. There were several assistants you could pick from all these fancy and fragrant oils. It was slow and sensual. How was anybody ever on time back then? Number 3, all the poison. There's always the one kid who's allergic to nuts on your flight. And it's horrible, now nobody gets nuts on this flight. It's tragic, really. Research shows that feeding infants peanuts or peanut products when they're around 4 to 6 months old can prevent a peanut allergy. But Roman emperors had their own way of achieving immunity. It was common for Roman kings to seek out and then consume a small amount of each known poison because they thought at the end of this grueling trial you would become immune to them all. It was a hot blend called Mithridatum, named of course after the poison's creator, Mithridates the Great. He lived until he was 80, so maybe these potions that he created might have actually worked. The world's first vaccine perhaps. Number 2, thumbs up or thumbs down. Giving somebody a thumbs up after they've done something, it feels nice. You're like, yeah. Even a sarcastic thumbs up, use those when you get cut off in traffic. In the hit film Gladiator, there's a scene where Joaquin Phoenix's character gives Russell Crowe's character a thumbs up, and in turn he lives, and then we watch cinematic redemption. In real life, ancient Romans used these thumb signs to determine a gladiator's fate in the Colosseum. It was referred to as pollici verso. It's the Latin term for a turned thumb. The crowd would vote if a gladiator should die or not, which is also insane. It's like America's Got Talent, but like insane. While it's nice to receive a thumbs up after doing something today, if you got a thumbs up or even a thumbs down, it meant your days of living have come to an end. And finally, number 1, animals in the arena. In order to spice up the classic fight and clashing swords till death action, sometimes gladiators would be put into the arena with an animal instead of another human being. Were they squirrels, maybe an opossum, or were they tigers or elephants, bears, lions, leopards, hyenas, wolves? Oh my god, they didn't win these often, did they? Animals were very expensive, so they weren't used all the time, but the organizers of the battle would go all out for the fights if they did include them. Like Logan Paul vs. Mayweather, it's a big social event. Most animals who were used in these great battles unfortunately didn't make it out alive. That's the horrible part as well. I'm a big animal lover, so much so that I'm rooting for the elephants in these fights while reading up about this. This led to another important factor down the road. People loved when animals were included, that eventually trade in exotic animals started taking place. This quickly took the hippo from the Nile and made them extinct. Now cut to today, thousands of species are going extinct.
Number 10. The blade, the wife, and the horse? If you love something, you gotta let it go. Or how about parading your naked wife in front of your friends in the mighty Roman military? Emperor Caligula was so impressed with his wife's beauty, he just thought he had to share it, even though apparently she wasn't that attractive, and already had children with another man. Scandalous. If she had wheels, she'd be the town bike, if you know what I'm saying. As if displaying your wife's gratuitous curves isn't scandalous enough, apparently he would use very real threats as a strange way of flirting. Clearly this was a dude who's got some issues. Like for example, the one time he wanted to humiliate the Roman Senate by claiming to make his horse a consul. Although he didn't actually go through with it. Still though, this one's all 6s and 9s, innit? This may have been related to a brothel caught disease. He might have had syphilis, I'm just saying. Number 9, no grain. Maximus Thrax was like most Roman emperors. Seized power when he wanted, seized land when he wanted, pretty much did whatever he wanted. Strangely enough, however, he cut subsidies for grain. This was one of the many tactics to help up cover for increased taxes. Taxes that were imposed because he had doubled the pay of the military during constant military action. That's a lot of coins needed. Eventually the people had had enough. And ironically, his own guards poked him with spears until he couldn't be poked anymore. I'm not a military expert or anything, but if you're gonna wage war, you gotta have the money for it. It's kind of like when the ice cream truck comes around and you're counting quarters for a large chocolate cone because you're 12 and life is hard and you deserve it. I love the ice cream truck. Number 8, Red Roman. Emperor Caracalla was also like many other Roman emperors, as he was quite bloodthirsty, and honestly just a bad dude. He unalived his brother Geta just because he didn't like him. Good reason, I guess. Then 20,000 of his brother's followers persecuted and killed. When some good folks heard about this terrible news, and were horrified, rightfully so, I mean who wouldn't be, they too were dealt with in a non-YouTube conduct safe way. He depleted the treasury from war and let foreigners have Roman citizenship. Now I know that sounds like a good thing, but it isn't. In already trying times, it completely messed up Roman societal culture. In a sense, fire is good. It allows us many things. But Caracalla threw a whole jerry can of gasoline on the fire by doing that. When your society is built on one thing, perhaps it's a good idea to not totally flip that upside down overnight, as quick decisions like that lead to quick downfalls. Just saying though, just saying. Number 7. The light of my life. Emperor Nero was straight up just not a cool guy. This whole list could be about him, but I'm here to make you laugh, not horrify you with the horrors of Pax Romana. Nero, like most emperors, was very wealthy, the kind of wealth that only people who shop at Whole Foods can understand. As it turns out, there was a fire in Rome at the time, burned for a long time, pretty big deal. Who started the fire? No one really knows, even though Nero himself might be a suspect. However, it would be really easy to get rid of a group of people you don't like if you blame it on them. So it was blamed on the hot new religion at the time, you gotta love them, Christians, except Nero didn't, and he was kind of egotistical, so in order to punish the scapegoated Christians, he had them set ablaze. So there was more light in his garden, so to speak, or that's what is said, at least. I know sometimes we can all disagree with our faith, but lighting each other on fire is not the answer. Mom always said if you have nothing nice to say, then don't light people on fire. Okay, Mom. Number 6. Not so Hercules. Commodus was like many other emperors in thinking that he was very close to the gods, but Commodus thought he was a Greek god, and reincarnated Hercules to be exact. So much so that he would often take up a role as a gladiator, which a lot of Romans thought was scandalous as a leader. A leader shouldn't be dealing with the barbarians at our gates and other lands that were persecuting and invading and taking over, rather than performing in blood sports. It was thought that this was below the office of the emperor. Rumors began to stir that because of his love for the arena, he may not be the royal bloodline claimed to be. When in the arena, his adversaries always surrendered, so he always won. In return, he wouldn't kill them, to be fair, just scarred them, as it was seen to be a good thing to be bested by the emperor and then to leave with a mark. Sure, we'll go with that. Apparently, they also brought animals in for him to slaughter in the arena for entertainment. Eventually, people had enough of him wasting time and money playing gladiator games, and he was strangled by his coach. Oh, hey coach, I'm ready for the next match. How you doing? Hey, why are you looking at me like that, man? What's wrong? And what's that robe for?
Number 5, the Black Banquet. A prank that went down in history. Don't worry, this is nothing like GOT's Red Wedding, thank goodness. Emperor Domitian had a pretty sick sense of humor and decided to host a party about it. In 90 AD, he invited a crowd of aristocrats to a banquet at Palatine Hill. When they arrived, the entire palace was decorated in black. Black velvet drapes, marble, everything was painted black, like the Rolling Stones song. Even the food was black and everything was illuminated by funeral lamps. Naked serving boys were painted from head to toe in black paint and served food and drink to all the guests. When they sat down, their place marks were tombs with their names on it, and instead of lush couches, they sat on cement slabs. So basically he was like, yeah, sit in your own grave. Domitian had killed several senators in the past, so everyone believed that they were never going to get out of there alive. It was like a huge metaphor for their own deaths. The emperor himself babbled about death and decay the entire night, so after the party was over and the guests made it home with their necks intact, Domitian sent gift baggies with their tombstones and onyx plates, and a now clean serving boy ready to do their bidding. Turns out the whole thing was a prank and the emperor was back at the palace laughing his butt off. Number 4, Bacchanalia. The party that was so wild, it got banned. One word, orgies. The Romans dug that kind of kinky shindig, but they like to pretend they didn't. Bacchanalia, the back guy, is a term used to describe a drunken, debaucherous party at frat houses or sororities, which isn't far off from the heyday. The Bacchanal celebrates the god Dionysus, also known as Bacchus, literally the god of wine and a damn good time. The celebration could include massive feasts, ritual parades and performances, and people carrying clusters of grapes around, and of course, wine. Lots and lots of wine. It used to just be held by women 3 times a year, but soon men were slowly admitted to the festivities and they started making it happen about 5 times a month. But this was the breeding ground for scandal, as it was rumored orgies and even human sacrifice occurred. So they were banned in 186 BCE, and if you ban something, you'll only make it more popular, so the celebrations continued covertly. So if you're into that kind of stuff, maybe forgo the human sacrifice, but there it is. Number 3, power play party. I've never lived within the aristocracy. I'm a blue collar gal. I'm never gonna know what it's like to be that rich. But I'm pretty sure this kind of who can throw the bigger party mentality hasn't really changed. In ancient Rome, parties were an opportunity to show off the amount of power a nobleman had. As soon as guests arrived, the extravagance and the rarity of the food, the vessels with which they were presented were all judged as soon as they were seen. Wine goblets and jugs had to be functional yet exquisite, made from luxurious materials like gold, silver, and precious stones. Back then, a middle-class family could afford silverware, so imagine what the nobles could do. This display of wealth played the long game, and it could mean political favors could be made down the road. So, sneaky sneaky. Number 2, Party Island. This is where it gets really dark. Ever sipped on a Capri Sun? Well, this story may taint that memory, so fair warning. The island of Capri became a rich retreat for the Roman aristocracy, known for its sadistic debauchery. Emperor Tiberius laid claim to this island as a haven for his horrendous and horrific behavior. He brought really young, too young male and female people of the night to serve him at his villa. The island became a kind of party place with absolutely no limits. From orgies in the caves to tormenting his servants on the rack as entertainment, Tiberius seemed to be the god Pan incarnate. In fact, he acted like it too. He made all of his participants slaves dress up as nymphs and goats while performing lewd acts. The island even became known as Goat Island, with Tiberius being called the Old Goat. Ugh. Unless you enjoy dangerous games and gross parties, this definitely wasn't the party island fit for anyone. And last but not least, number 1, Caligula. Caligulas Parties. Let's not go there. If you're a fan of Roman history, then you are familiar with the 2 most horrific emperors that ever were. One of them was Caligula. Though he started out pretty good, after an extreme bout of fever, his disposition entirely changed. Maybe it was because of the lead, we don't know. Many believed he was insane, as his cruelty knew no bounds, even when it came to joyous occasions. Caligula's thing was that he liked to embarrass the wives of his officials for some reason, and also his officials. He would force specifically married couples to his banquets, and then steal the wives away throughout the night and then violate them against their wishes. But his torment doesn't end there. He would then relay to the entire party everything that he did in graphic detail and enjoy the frozen shock on everyone's faces because they couldn't do anything about it. It's no wonder he was eventually assassinated. Even at a party, this guy knew how to kill the mood. He wasn't the only emperor to turn the dial on creepy, Tiberius, when the party started, but if you had to choose whose party to go to, this one plus Tiberius, both of them, just don't go near them. Go to another time frame. Just imagine it otherwise.